We've all heard some version of this before. She's overreacting, being dramatic, too emotional, impossible to deal with, unstable, hysterical. She's crazy. What's particularly disturbing is how often this same narrative shows up in classic literature. Again and again, we meet women who are grieving, angry, trapped, frightened, resistant, or unwilling to keep pretending. And instead of being understood, they're often turned into the problem. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Dr. Whitney Kosters, and I have been an English professor for the past 2 decades. And one of the things I've learned from teaching literature is that the mad woman is almost never just a character type. She's usually where the text's deepest pressures collect: gender, power, marriage, medicine, respectability, desire, class, and who gets believed. So in this lecture, I want to look at what these so-called crazy women reveal when we stop treating the label as an explanation and start treating it as a clue. Because crazy does more than just describe a character. It can decide how we're supposed to read a woman. Once that label is attached, it becomes much easier to ridicule her, dismiss her, misunderstand her, or completely ignore her. Her anger can look like overreaction, her fear can look like weakness, her resistance can look like danger, and the people around her don't have to take her seriously. Now, there's a long history behind this. For centuries, women's distress was often interpreted through the body instead of being taken seriously as perception, protest, grief, or knowledge. Even the word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, and ancient medical theories imagined women's suffering as connected to this wandering womb. That history may sound bizarre now, but the underlying move is still recognizable. Instead of asking what a woman is responding to, culture often turns the woman herself into the explanation. So in this video, we will look at the Yellow Wallpaper, Jane Eyre, Hamlet, and A Rose for Emily. But I don't want to make the easy argument that every woman called mad is secretly innocent or simply misunderstood. That's just not the case, and it would weaken the literature. Some of these women are very frightening and destructive. Some do things that simply can't be excused. So the stronger reading is not she was never really crazy. It's what becomes easier to ignore once everyone agrees she is. So let's start with Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, because if we read this story through a feminist lens, which most people do, it gives us one of the clearest examples of how a woman's protest can be renamed as illness. The narrator is confined by her husband, John, who is also her doctor. And that overlap is crucial because his authority comes from both marriage and medicine. He decides where the narrator stays, what she does, how much stimulation she can handle, whether her judgment can be trusted, and what her suffering actually means. He tells her she needs rest, forbids writing and working, laughs at her fears, calls her little girl, and insists that his control is care. Now, Gilman was responding to a very real medical culture here. After being treated by Dr. Weir Mitchell, the nerve specialist associated with the rest cure, Gilman wrote this story as a warning about the damage caused by enforced rest, isolation, overfeeding, and the removal of intellectual work from women's lives. So, when John tells the narrator not to write, not to work, and not to think too much, the story isn't just giving us one bad husband. It is criticizing a system that treated female thought, creativity, and resistance as symptoms. What makes this story so devastating is that the narrator keeps trying to reach beyond the enclosure. Her secret writing is a form of protest. Her private journal becomes the place where she can still interpret her own experience, even while everyone around her treats that interpretation as unreliable. She tells us that work and stimulation would help, that John doesn't understand her suffering, and that the treatment is making everything worse. The domestic space becomes part of this argument. The room is supposed to be restful, but it looks and feels like confinement, with barred windows, a nailed-down bed, torn wallpaper, and a woman trapped behind a pattern that no one else is willing to read. From the outside, the house may look like a place of care, but inside, Obedience is being confused with recovery. The wallpaper gives form to what the narrator can't safely say directly. The woman trapped behind the pattern isn't just a strange image. Through a feminist lens, she becomes the truth of the narrator's position made visible. She is the wife inside marriage, the patient inside medicine, the thinking person inside a world that treats thought itself as danger, if you're a woman. So, when the narrator becomes obsessed with the wallpaper, the point isn't only that her mind is breaking. The structure containing her is finally being read for what it actually is. John sees illness where there is protest, fragility where there's intelligence, childness where there's resistance. By the end, when the wallpaper comes down, the act is disturbing, but it's also a desperate refusal to remain inside the pattern that has enclosed her. And this is the final devastating irony. By the time the narrator finally breaks, the system that helped break her can use that breakdown as proof that it was right all along. Now she can be dismissed completely. Now she can be institutionalized, ignored, pitied, or treated as someone whose words no longer require an answer. When a woman's resistance is renamed as instability, the world around her gets to protect itself. Now, Jane Eyre gives us a different but related problem. In the Yellow Wallpaper, the woman is writing to us from inside the enclosure. In Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason is almost never allowed to narrate herself at all. The question is not only what she experiences, but who gets to explain her. Bertha is one of the most famous madwomen in literature. Locked in the attic by Rochester and described through violent, excessive, animalistic, and terrifying language, she first appears to many readers as the obstacle to Jane and Rochester's romance. But Bertha is also confined inside other people's descriptions. We don't get her full voice, her version of the marriage, or full access to her history, rage, desire, and despair. The novel gives us Bertha largely through Rochester's explanation and through a structure that makes her frightening before it makes her knowable. So madness here isn't only a condition. It's also a story someone else gets to tell. Once Bertha is named mad, almost everything done to her becomes easier to justify. Imprisonment can be framed as protection. Silencing can be called necessity. Rage can be treated as proof that confinement was deserved in the first place. Now, Bertha's violence is real within the novel, and we certainly don't have to pretend otherwise. But the question is why Rochester's suffering is made so much more available than Bertha's. His pain becomes part of the romance, while hers becomes part of the horror. That is what makes Bertha such a powerful figure in feminist criticism to me. She isn't only a woman in an attic. She's a reminder that narrative access is power. If one person gets to tell the story, that person often gets to decide who sounds reasonable, who sounds dangerous, who deserves sympathy, and who can be locked away for everyone's safety. So, when people ask whether Bertha is mad, I think the stronger question is what the label of madness allows the novel to avoid. Once Bertha is framed as monstrous, the novel doesn't have to give her equal narrative standing. Rochester can remain tragic instead of purely brutal, and the reader can keep moving toward the romance without fully sitting with the violence that made that romance possible. If Bertha shows us what happens when a woman's story is told almost entirely by someone else, Ophelia in Hamlet shows us what happens when a woman's own speech has been managed for so long that by the time words finally come freely, the world has already decided not to hear them. So Ophelia is often remembered as fragile, beautiful, passive, and mad. Her madness has been turned into an aesthetic image for centuries. The flowers, the songs, the drowning. But if we only romanticize Ophelia's madness, we miss how much pressure has been placed on her before she breaks. She lives in a world where male authority constantly manages her speech. Her father instructs her, her brother warns her, Hamlet mocks, rejects, and wounds her, and the court watches. Her sexuality is monitored, obedience is expected, and her interior life is rarely treated as her own. Before the madness, Ophelia is often spoken to, spoken about, and used. Then her father is killed by the man she loves, and the structures that gave her identity completely collapse. It's important to note that when madness enters the play, it comes through fragments, songs, flowers, and strange symbolic language, but that language isn't empty. Her songs suggest sexual betrayal and grief, death, and corruption. She says indirectly what cannot be said directly. In fact, Ophelia may become most truthful at the very moment when the court can most easily dismiss her. While obedient, she is legible but not free. Once mad, she becomes expressive but not believed. A woman who behaves properly can be controlled, while a woman who speaks too strangely, too emotionally, or too openly can be dismissed. That's why Ophelia's madness is not just a beautiful tragedy. It's a critique of a world that gives a woman no stable place from which to speak. The court can pity her, aestheticize her, and mourn her, but it doesn't have to answer her. Once madness becomes the frame, attention moves away from what was done to her and toward the spectacle of what she's become. By the time we get to Emily Grierson in A Rose for Emily, the question widens again. We're no longer looking at one husband, one doctor, one lover, or even one court. We're looking at an entire community that turns a woman into a public story and then acts as if it has no responsibility for what that story becomes. Emily is certainly disturbing. By the end of Faulkner's story, Homer's corpse is found in the upstairs room, strongly implying that Emily poisoned him and kept the body there for years. There's no responsible way to soften that into simple victimhood. But if the only question we ask is, what's wrong with Emily, then we end up reading her exactly the way the town does, as a curiosity, a horror, a scandal, and a grotesque local legend. The narration is essential here because Emily is not presented to us as a full human being. She's presented as a fallen monument, a relic of the Old South, a duty, a tradition, almost a public object the town believes it has the right to interpret. The community reveres her, pities her, judges her, gossips about her, interferes with her, and finally consumes her story as entertainment. That communal voice is not neutral. The narrator speaks through public memory, rumor, judgment, and controlled suspense. He knows more than we do. He withholds information from us, and he rearranges time and turns Emily's life into a mystery we're invited to join and solve. In other words, the story doesn't just show us a woman being watched. It makes us complicit because it makes us part of the watching. So Emily's mental state can't be separated from the town's treatment of her. Her father isolates her and turns away suitors. The town watches her, judges her relationship with Homer, sends people to interfere, sneaks onto her property at night to sprinkle lime around the house, and after her death, breaks open the locked room she kept private for decades. Even in death, Emily is not allowed to remain uninvaded or unviolated. So yes, Emily is certainly horrifying, but the town is horrifying too. Her closed house becomes the physical form of a larger social sickness. It belongs to the Old South, to rank, inheritance, reputation, racial history, gender control, and public decay. The town wants to treat Emily as the strange remnant of a dead world, but the story keeps showing us that the town is implicated in the very decay it projects onto her. Emily becomes the grotesque center of the story, but she isn't the only thing rotting. Once she's labeled crazy, perverse, strange, or monstrous, the town can keep telling her story without fully examining its own role in producing her isolation. Her crime and violence are real, but the label allows the community to turn her into the problem while avoiding the patriarchal control, social surveillance, class nostalgia, and communal voyeurism that shaped her life. And this is the larger point. In these texts, madness is not just a private condition inside a woman's mind. It's often the place where a social order reveals itself. Marriage, medicine, family, class, respectability, inheritance, and public reputation all promise stability, but for these women, those same structures become forms of confinement. When a woman can no longer survive inside them, the culture around her often treats her collapse as proof that she was the problem all along. That's the move we have to learn how to see because it doesn't just stay inside fiction. The language is old, and unfortunately, this issue remains with us. Women are still called crazy when they name a problem, dramatic when they refuse to minimize it, difficult when they set a boundary, bitter when they remember harm accurately, unstable when they are angry, and too emotional when their reaction makes other people uncomfortable. In workplaces, families, relationships, medicine, politics, and public life, a woman's tone, grief, anger, or intensity can become the focus so quickly that the thing she's responding to disappears from view. That's why recognizing this pattern in literature is not just an academic exercise. Literature gives us a slowed down version of a process that often happens very quickly in real life. We can watch the label be applied all the time. We can see who applies it, and we can notice what gets hidden once the label sticks. And we can ask whether the woman is actually irrational or whether her response has become inconvenient to the people around her. This is exactly what literature trains us to do. It teaches us to become suspicious of the moment when a person's reaction becomes the whole story. Because when that happens, the marriage, the family, the diagnosis, the doctor, the husband, the boyfriend, the friend, the workplace, the institution, the community, or the person with more power no longer has to be examined. So the next time a woman in literature is called mad, hysterical, irrational, monstrous, unstable, or impossible to trust, don't stop there. Ask who benefits from that description. Ask what her reaction is being used to hide. Ask what the story becomes easier to believe once she's no longer treated as fully credible. Because the so-called mad woman is often not the place where the text stops making sense. She is the place where the text starts telling the truth. If this lecture made a familiar character feel more complicated or made a word like crazy feel less simple than it did before, I invite you to subscribe and join me here. I use this channel to connect literature to real human experience, including the stories that we inherit, the power structures we live inside, and the ways reading can change what we notice in the world around us. I also post videos on writing, research, AP English exam prep, and my Villains series where I look at some of literature's most fascinating, morally complicated characters. In the comments, tell me which so-called mad woman you think deserves a closer reading, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Be well.